G'day cunts. Today I'm talking about believing the victims of sexual assault. So obvious content warnings apply here. This is a topic that owes most of its recent momentum to the nomination to the Supreme Court of the US and subsequent accusations of sexual assault, i.e. rape, in regards to Brett Kavanaugh. I do want to speak more generally than this one example, but I will have something to say about this single case towards the end. As a perhaps more pointed example of what I'm specifically talking about in this video though, let's see what David Smalley had to say following on from Vadim Newquist talking about criticising the left at the most recent MythCon. Here we will see old mate Dave raising the topic in question with a seamlessness usually reserved for a Gallagher sketch.
One thing that is sort of synonymous with the left is GMO skepticism, which I think is absolute bullshit. And people who think that GMOs are dangerous, and I call that out. There are certain left-wingers who have been like 9/11 conspiracy theorists, and I will say that they're full of shit.
Okay,
so I am not reluctant to call out the left when it needs to be called out.
David, so we've touched on this topic of skepticism now.
Thank you.
So what are the key topics that separate skeptics from atheists that you've noticed? Things that you can touch on where you can realize, okay, well, this person doesn't believe in God, but they're not behaving rationally on other topics. What are some of the things that flag this up to you in your work?
Oh, this is one of them. This is a perfect example of, especially within an online community, if you will, of people saying things like, I'm a skeptic, I demand evidence for your claim. Unless that claim is about sexual assault, then there's no evidence required. Let's destroy this person's career.
So you're not in the camp of automatically believe accusers?
Not automatically, no. I think they should be taken seriously and looked into and investigated and not blown off, because that's important.
But yeah, you've missed the point by so much here, Dave. As has the MythCon audience though, so at least you're not really alone. So yeah, I reckon that when it comes to the idea of believing sexual assault victims, something pretty significant has been lost along the way. And yeah, the idea as wrongly presented in this example has also fed into the fears and served the political narratives of some. The idea that originally at least lay behind statements like always believe the victim or the less loaded always believe someone disclosing sexual assault to you was not about the conviction in the court of public opinion or otherwise for apparent perpetrators. What this was about was trying to change the responses that were way too often the default received by people choosing to disclose sexual assault. Namely, those responses way too often included doubt. Now this was and I think still is an issue that comes up pretty broadly. Many, if not the majority of people had, and perhaps still have, the same reactions of doubt in these circumstances, and there are many reasons for it. Some of these reasons are perhaps more forgivable and understandable than others. I'll let you lot be the judges there. But some that come to mind for me are, in the case of family members for example, perhaps just not wanting to believe that such a horrible thing could happen to a loved one. In the case of, say, police, perhaps them jumping straight into trying to establish if a conviction is at all possible. And of course, a good chunk of this at least comes from the narrative that false accusations run rampant as well. More on that in just a tick though. Because the point was and is, victims need support when they disclose, and you don't lend support by offering doubt. In fact, the very opposite is true. Support looks instead like asking the victim how you can support them. Perhaps if the situation calls for it, helping them to link in with counselling, or maybe just assuring them that you still see them as the same person. That sort of thing. I'm sure those of us who are lucky enough to have not been survivors of sexual assault can appreciate that being doubted by those you disclose to, as opposed to these supportive options, would have been painful to say the fucking least. Now, in offering support in this way, the biggest risk that we run is lending support to a non-victim. Now, considering the outcomes of not supporting real victims, I've got to say this risk doesn't really register, and I doubt it does for many of us really. Note, however, that none of these examples imply even slightly that we should convict those accused based solely on testimony. In fact, it's quite similar to what Smalley said before. Take them seriously and investigate. Really, that's pretty close to what believing the victims was and is supposed to be about. You and yours are rallying against something I don't think really exists, mate. Like, yeah, we can believe people who say they have survived sexual assault in order to support them, without it being implied that we are going to rush ahead and convict those accused of being perpetrators in a court of law, or as I mentioned, the court of public opinion. And that lack of conviction is sometimes okay. We need and should have a high standard of evidence in our legal systems, But again, the opposite was never the point. The point of believing the victim was intended as a guide for those who wanted to and or should be helping survivors in a really, really vulnerable time. Now, I mentioned before that the idea of false rape accusations being common is bullshit. It is. Source in the description. It's a touch over 2% of reported allegations in Australia that are determined to be false. But there is another related point here worth addressing, that being the very low rate of convictions for sexual assault generally. For example, these stats from CASA that say that in Oz only 17% of reported sexual assaults result in a conviction. Taken with the roughly 2% that are determined false accusations, that's about 80% of accusations in which the legal system essentially goes, dunno. Things get murky here, because one would need to assess each example on its merits to establish exactly why this happened in each case. Certainly though, some of this is down to a, overly high standard of evidence required to establish guilt, or perhaps an overly forgiving attitude from the so-called justice system. Take for instance this Four Corners episode entitled I'm That Girl, discussing how a young man skated on a conviction for a rape because on appeal the judge decided that his victim wasn't clear enough that she wasn't consenting. Can anyone say teach men not to rape? That's a whole other video though. The point here is that there are absolutely some examples in which the standard for conviction is too high, for whatever reason. Now this is where I briefly do talk about the Kavanaugh example. In the Kavanaugh example, we have a woman with the testimony of 4 other people to corroborate her speaking of her experiences prior to the nomination. Now that should be enough to at least bring a trial, if not a conviction. This is probably why at least some of Kavanaugh's support has moved from doubting the story to excusing his behaviour. Absolutely though, this should all be enough to keep Kavanaugh from becoming a Supreme Court judge. Really, if the worst thing resulting from a wide-reaching conspiracy that we have to assume doesn't exist until proof is provided, is that a dude with a serious question mark hanging over his head isn't appointed to one of the key positions of power in the US for life, that's just fucking fine. But while all this is important, and while I think there needs to be a serious look at how we respond to sexual assault in the justice system, and while these are related factors to my main point here, believing victims can and should be considered independently from that. Believing those who say they are victims and thereby offering them support is not in any way an implication that a conviction must follow. And that's the point that folks like Smalley and the mythcon audience seem to have missed. At any rate, that was your nah. Cheers.